So, without further ado, we have Leanne and Tim presenting on hack-in, cash-out, hacking and securing payment technologies.
Thank you. So, appreciate that it's after lunch, so really appreciate you coming to the talk. And we want to talk to you about payment technologies today and generally around the security issues associated with them. So first, I thought I would introduce ourselves by explaining to you why we're qualified to talk on this area. So we were both born in the 80s, which means we were born approximately 20 years after the first cash dispenser was installed in Barclays in London. It also means that we've suffered through the introduction of many new payment technologies. We also work with payments every day, so we work for a company called Positive Technologies, and we carry out research in this specific area. Last year, in fact, we bought an ATM and dismantled it all the way down to the safe. And like you, we also interact with payment technologies every day. So we'll start from the idea that the payments ecosystem is a complex place. When we were coming up with this talk, we realized that whilst we all interact with payments every day and they facilitate us to do lots of different tasks, it's very hard to actually understand how they work and the security issues associated with them. So if you take a look at this image here, it can seem really overwhelming. But all this really represents is lots of different payment systems. So at the core of this process is always a bank, and in this case I'm talking about traditional money, not Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. And what this does is it allows you to transfer funds from one individual to another. And this includes cash-to-cash transfers as well, because they always involve a bank. So if I break this down a little bit further into three components, you have payment instruments, payment system operators, and payment delivery channels. This is a much easier way of looking at what a payment system is. So a payment instrument is a method by which you can pay. So for example, using a check in the case of paper payments, or cash, or you could use a card to carry out a contactless payment or a swipe transaction, or electronic payments. So that includes direct debit, standing orders, and any electronic transfers that you might make to any other individuals or businesses. Then we have payment system operators. So they sit at the core of this, and that's typically your banks and your clearinghouses. And then you have payment delivery channels. Payment delivery channels are things like ATMs, point of sales terminals, and payment gateways. These are the endpoints of most of these systems, and most of us as consumers interact with these every day. So for the purpose of this talk, we'll be focusing on payment delivery channels, and that's for a number of reasons. The first is, from a security perspective, they're the first entry point into these systems. They are first focused on by attackers, and it's relatively easy to get hold of these as well from a security perspective. So if you're a criminal or you're a researcher, you can obtain some of these delivery channels, so you could buy a point of sales terminal, or you can interact with it as a consumer and start learning information about it. It's much harder, for example, to understand the mechanisms in place inside a payment system operator, unless, of course, you work for a bank. So that's why we'll be focusing on those endpoints, so ATMs and point of sales terminals, as well as card payments. So first we'd like to talk about ATMs.
One, two. Oh, great. So last year there were 50 years old anniversary of first installed ATM. And now it is like around 4 million ATM operating all over the world. But the problem is that since these 50 years, in the last 50 years, not too many things from security perspective significantly changed, for big surprise. A quick overview from a customer perspective of the main ATM parts. First of all, of course, on top there is a computer inside of service area with a monitor, card reader, encrypted keyboard, and so on. So mainly the main point of interaction with a customer. Next, and the main part is cash dispenser, which is inside of a vault, contains from 4 to 6 cassettes for each type of nodes, and of course network part, which helps to interact with bank side. And surprisingly, cryptography is probably really the main basis of security in every bank. And for example, if you are speaking about ATM, for example, crypto keyboard and HSM system, key developer system, for example, Visa network connection is really well secured because they are full of cryptography and so on. But in fact, there are so many ways to compromise your ATMs that sometimes banks who were compromised came up to us and like, guys, we have no idea how we were robbed. For example, not many banks understand that if hackers can compromise one ATM, they can get access to the whole ATM network. Or, for example, upside down. If hackers can compromise for operator endpoint in a bank, it's just a matter of time, what time they will need to spend to get access to ATM network. So let's make a quick overview of attacks, modern attacks on ATMs. And I'm not going to speak about, brute force and physical exploitation of ATMs like gas or dynamite. We'll speak about more sophisticated, more logical attacks like operating system attacks, well known as jackpotting, when hackers launch their own piece of malware on ATM which sends command to get the money, or hardware attacks, which also well known as black box attacks, when hackers, instead of interaction with operating systems, send direct commands to cash dispenser to get money, as well as network vulnerabilities and misconfigurations, which can also bring to the same situations. So this is a picture from dark web, which says what exactly you need to drill holes to just basically directly connect your keyboard or mouse to ATM. And maybe still not everyone understands that major of ATMs are based on Windows operating system, from Windows XP to Windows 10, for example. Which means if you can connect your own keyboard and mouse, even cats should be able to run their own piece of malware to cash out money through the jackpotting attack. That's why, of course, a lot of ATM vendors implement their own pieces of security mechanisms, like kiosk mode. Kiosk mode, this is a kind of restriction against using hotkeys, other interactions with Shell or Explorer. For example, not everyone knows that 99% of ATMs, from our perspective, has pre-installed File Manager on them. Also, one of main protection against this is when hackers could not easily plug in their own keyboards or mouses, so use kind of device control systems. But in the end, if your cat will be able to connect its own hardware, its own keyboard and mouse, and launch its own code, get access to Explorer, that's basically what will happen. Yes, her cat. So we run our own specially crafted piece of malware, and which says, give me X amount of nodes from cassette number Y, and yeah, here we go. And of course, this is how it meant to work, because operating systems should send command to peripherals like, give me this amount of node from this cassette. It works with API well known as MSXFS, created by, surprisingly, company Microsoft. And when these attacks started to appear, ATM vendors started to implement their own protection, which calls application control. Application control presented by major antivirus vendors like Kaspersky, McAfee, Checkpoint, but instead of antiviruses and signature-based analysis, they work in a way of creating whitelist of software which should be able to launch, and every other software is going to a blacklist, which means if hacker will bring his own malware, it will not be launched based on these whitelist, blacklist restrictions. But the problem, there are two problems. First is that this software honestly doesn't work out of the box. It should be customized very slightly for every particular ATM, for every particular configuration. That means that in last 5-6 years appeared so many researches about how to bypass default rules, how to run your own arbitrary code for example, Microsoft AppLocker and other products. And the second problem is that also how we understood only recently, even security software vendors sometimes make their own mistakes in software and make their own, which can bring to findings like 0 days in this software, which can bring us to exploit these vulnerabilities and have maximum privileges on the system and bypass all these restrictions. For example, in the last 2 years, we found around 5 0 days in all kinds of these products. Next part is about black box. So once again, instead of connecting to computer with your mouse and keyboard, hackers drill the same holes in special places in front of ATMs or get access to service area and connect directly to cash dispenser, which hold inside of safe box. Then, after connecting their own hardware like Arduino or small laptop with their own software, which can be also hidden in service area if hackers have access to it, they will send remote commands to say, give me this amount of notes from this cassette, and some dude will come up and take this money back. First, this attack was presented by Barnaby Jack in 2013, and since that, of course, all major antivirus vendors started to implement their own security mechanisms, which were surprisingly cryptography. They started to make encryption channel between computer and cash dispenser to protect against manipulation of data, tampering of data, and so on. But they honestly did not do this very well. First time we reported this kind of vulnerability in 2014 to NCR, and in 2017 they still have lack of very well created encryption. During all summer of last year, we and our colleagues were sending them a lot of videos with proof of concepts how their security mechanisms might be bypassed. But they were answering us, well, guys, it doesn't look like it's a real one, it's kind of fraud, it's not real attacks. Until in September of 2017, some guys in Mexico, some actual hackers, really exploited this vulnerability and got access to money. And only after that, surprisingly, in February of 2018, they fixed their encryption channel with brand new one security, which should be totally well protected. But really, idea is that the major answer from every ATM vendors is that, guys, if you want to mitigate your black box attacks, you should buy brand new one ATMs, because old one will not help against this. But the problem is that even brand new one ATMs, you will not have 100% guarantee that your ATMs will be protected against this type of attack. And the last case is about network. You all might be familiar with this kind of situations when from ATM stocking out some kind of wires which go into network devices like routers and somewhere else, which means if hacker will connect his own device here, he might first of all try to exploit some Windows operating system vulnerabilities, and second, he can try and tamper the answers from processing center by saying, do not give me X nodes from cassettes of $10 nodes. Give me X cassettes from X nodes from $100 nodes, and obviously get money. But I want to share you another story. A couple of months ago, we had ATM security assessment project in one of the bank in a very big city, and after a while, we asked them, do you want us to make a network devices security assessment? Their network was working with GSM industrial modems, which were held inside of service area. And they said, oh no guys, you totally will not get access to the whole our network of ATMs via one ATM, because everything is very restricted, network is very segmented, everything is good, no worries. I said, okay, let's try. And guess what, 48 hours later, our reverse engineers guys, what did they found? They found that this GSM modem were using their own proprietary VPN, which worked like end-to-end tunnel. And the problem is that binary file which were held in GSM modem was exactly the same as in a processing center. And all these binary files had remote code execution. Which means 48 hours later, we basically just got a screenshot of HTML page of ATM management system, get access to this ATM, execute this code. We were like, oh, great. But only like 15, 20 minutes later, we understood it was not management system of a bank. It was management system of engineer company who were maintaining, not one bank, they were maintaining 10 banks in a very big city, which means you could get access to ATMs in every bank of this city. This is just unbelievable, yeah. So why this really happens recently in the last 2-3 years, and why these attacks are growing up? Not only in Europe, of course, and for example, Eastern Asia, but in America as well. Why this continue to growing up and growing up? Well, first of all, as Lynn already said, it is quite easy to buy your own ATM, not for research, but your own bad things, for your own bad things, to start to make your own dodgy researches. And secondly, hackers are quite lazy guys. There are a very small amount of guys who really do some kind of researches, who really create new malware and things like that. And other guys just sit and wait until they can buy something. And in dark web, you can find so many offers to buy specially crafted manuals, how to drill ATMs, where you should drill, what malware you should launch. Malware in 2017 even started to use one-time password codes to protect against, some kind of fraud inside of hackers groups. And this is so ridiculous that guys really can go and buy, take and use, and that's why, of course, these attacks are growing up.
So next I'm going to talk about card payments, which is something we interact with every day. And specifically, I'll be focusing on cardholder present transactions. So that's your chip and signature, your swipe transactions, contactless, even though it doesn't include additional cardholder verification, and also at times keyed PAN entry. So that's the primary account number that runs across the front of your card. Okay, so what happens exactly when you make a transaction? So normally when you're in a shop or a restaurant, you would hand your card over to the merchant, or you might tap your card against the terminal. At that point, the information is sent to the acquiring bank for that company. They'll then ask the card brands to determine who your issuing bank is, and then your issuing bank is going to check some really basic information like, do you have enough credit facility? If it's a debit card, have you got enough balance in your accounts? And are they happy for you to make that payment? They then send all that information back along the stream and pass it back to the merchant. Sounds pretty simple, but if we go a bit deeper into that process, in this case, you can see a flow diagram for NFC payments. It's actually quite a bit more complicated. But for the purposes of this presentation and in order to understand many of the security risks associated with card payments, you don't need to understand each of these steps step by step. So first I'll talk a little bit about chip and PIN transactions. So chip and PIN hasn't been that widely adopted in the US, but it's been widely adopted in Europe, and it was hailed as really an answer to many of the problems with swiped transactions. As most of us know, swiped transactions are really easy to, for example, duplicate the card. It's easy to forge a signature as well. So along came chip and PIN. It sounded great. It provided a level of assurance for the cardholder verification. But unfortunately, in 2010, some researchers from Aperture Labs said, we found some fundamental flaws in chip and PIN. It turns out for SDA chips in cards, which most of us are issued with, there's a big problem. So if you make a transaction with a terminal that's offline, there are two major issues. The first is that the PIN is transmitted in clear text, so it can be harvested. The second is that you can actually bypass the PIN verification altogether. So there goes your cardholder verification. But what's particularly interesting about this is we actually tested this in the last 2 weeks, and it still works. So it's still a massive problem. So this all sounds fascinating, but there's another area of card payments which is almost more interesting and easier to carry out fraud. So NFC, we're all familiar with NFC. It's relatively recently been adopted into payments, but it was first utilized for transport systems. So first used by the UPass in Korea, then in the early 2000s it was adopted by Transport for London, and it was slowly integrated into many of the products that we have as consumers. And now it accounts for around 40% of all non-cash transactions. So why exactly is this so attractive to fraudsters? Well, first of all, it doesn't have any additional cardholder verification. It's also much easier to clone a transaction or intercept a token for an NFC payment than it is to clone a card. It has pretty low limits, but they're quite considerable. So, for example, if you were to steal someone's card and you didn't want to provide any additional cardholder verification, you could probably go around making payments for quite some time before the card's blocked. Another fact that's really interesting about NFC is that you can have a higher limit within which the country your card was issued than within which the country you're paying for. So something interesting occurs here. You can make a payment for a higher value than the local limit without additional cardholder verification. And it's pretty much embedded in everything. So you can see that it's very attractive to criminals. But something interesting happened, which is between the period of 2015 and 2018, there weren't really that many reported cases of fraud associated with contactless. Sure, there were many academic examples of attacks that were focused on this area, but not so many confirmed cases in the media. Come round to 2018, and there's a report in the UK of losses up to 5.6 million associated with contactless. So why exactly is this happening? There only seems to be two logical explanations. The first is that often in security, when we carry out research and we provide proof of concepts, it takes a little bit of time to start seeing these examples in the wild. And the second is that banks don't really like to talk about bad things that happen to them. So what does the NFC attack surface look like? Well, it turns out you can pretty much interact with all aspects of the transaction. So you can start to identify weaknesses in the point of enrollment. You can harvest the token between the card or the mobile wallet and the terminal. You could exploit vulnerabilities in the terminal or logic in the terminal, or you could intercept or interact with the merchant network directly. So tokenization, this is the point of enrollment, was meant to be a much more secure way of making payments. So when you enroll your card into a mobile wallet, it's replaced with a virtual representation of itself, and the original value is placed in a token vault. The other thing that's important about tokens is they should only be valid for a short period of time, and they should be unique. But as it turns out, there are quite a few issues with this. So the researcher Salvador Mendoza, he found that for Samsung Pay, there's actually quite a considerable lifetime for tokens, typically at least 24 hours. And last year, Tim also identified some issues with Apple Pay, which basically mean that as an attacker, you could intercept a payment if you were making a payment on through an app or a website, and you can actually modify the product or the transaction amount, and you can reuse the token. So some considerable issues there. So next, we'll take a look at the point of interaction between the mobile wallet or the card and the terminal. So you may be quite familiar with these terms relay and preplay. And essentially, the point of this as an attacker is you are trying to intercept the token before it gets used by the consumer. So a really simple example of this is that you would have two mobile phones with a connection over public Wi-Fi, and one would act as a reader, so you would read from someone else's card or phone, and then this would transmit the information, and the other phone would then act as a card and pass that information to the merchant before the other person had been able to use their token. So if we have a look at this in action, so this is slightly more complicated. This is a project I worked on with Salvador Mendoza, so he does a lot of work around NFC. This is an implementation with two readers and a dedicated RF channel, which means that instead of relying on, for example, a Wi-Fi connection, which can introduce lag into the process and could stop the transaction from occurring, this is much faster. So you can see as I play the video, on this side, we're actually reading the card, so this is acting like a terminal. You can see the card's been read there. And I'm about to walk around 30 foot to the other side where we'll see the original card. So how have payments and fraud evolved over the last couple of years? As I mentioned previously, there's been a significant focus on NFC payments. That's because of the fact that they have reasonable limits. They're an acceptable risk to banks. So they know that they're going to have fraud through this method, but there's not too much they can do about it. The thing about NFC is as soon as you introduce additional cardholder verification, you start affecting the user experience. The second thing that has happened is there's been a focus on something called authorization anomaly or attack stream fraud. What this looks like is really that you're trying to abuse the logic of the different mechanisms in the system. So you would be looking at the endpoints like ATMs, point of sales terminals, payment gateways, and you're trying to identify vulnerabilities in them. Then, from there, you're trying to work out if you can utilize any other mechanisms in that system. The part that effectively acts as a black box, so the operators of the system, to try and see if you can actually multiply the value of what you found and make many different fraudulent transactions. So that might sound a bit complicated, but I'll give you some examples of what that looks like. In its simplest form, this is an example of an authorization anomaly for a bank. So imagine that you walk into a bar and you hand over your card to make a payment for a few drinks. Imagine if that bartender in fact has a fraudulent terminal and that bartender swipes your card across both terminals. That's completely valid within this system. You can make transactions milliseconds apart with contactless. That's completely valid, but that's not how the system should be used. Of course, you could interact with the merchant network directly, and if you were able to do that, you can do things like modify the amount, change your merchant code. You could issue a credit instead of a debit. Then we have another interesting example. So this is fallback. So as I mentioned, in Europe, we use chip and PIN, which is meant to be the highest form of security and highest form of cardholder verification for payments. If you take your card to a shop and say you're a criminal and you're trying to carry out an attack, and you've stolen that card and you don't know what the PIN is, you could insert the card upside down or tape over the chip. It would quite likely, if configured like most normal terminals, revert to something called fallback, which is a lower form of cardholder verification. So it then asks you to swipe your card. So you would do that and you would sign for the transaction, which it's pretty easy to sign for someone's signature. The problem with this is that the liability of any risk associated with the payment shifts from the bank to the merchant. So it's really significant for banks if this happens. Or not, sorry, it's really significant for merchants if this happens. The next example we have is cross-technology attacks. So it's quite possible that you can harvest a token from a contactless mobile wallet and actually use that information to write to the magnetic stripe of a card. You can actually then pay for this in a shop using that card. Another fascinating example is that there's often a small lag between the point of the finalization of the authorization and sending this information to the bank. So you can take your card to a shop, insert the card, assuming you're using chip and PIN, verify for the transaction, and as you do that, if you had the terminal in your own hands, it's possible to reset the OS of the terminal. You would then be issued with a receipt, which for all intensive purposes looks like the transaction has completed, but this information never gets sent to the bank. But what happens is it reboots, it still maintains all the other information it needs to connect to the network. So you have the possibility of getting a free TV, which is great. And this last example, which is probably the most critical example of all, is a credit master attack. So in 2016, a bank called the Tesco Bank in the UK was hit by this particular attack vector, and it caused them a loss of £2.5 million. So the reason why this is so significant is a lot of banks now are very worried about this because it could be financially crippling for them. Think of it like a distributed guessing attack. When you're an attacker who wants to determine entire bin ranges of cards, so in order to do that and in order to make transactions with that information, you need a few things. So you need cardholder name and address, you need the card number, you need potentially the start date, but definitely the end date, and the security code or the CVV information. But as it turns out, in a lot of cases, to make payments, you don't necessarily need all that information. That's often because merchants aren't checking that information. Researchers at Cambridge University also found that it's actually quite practical to implement this. You simply distribute the guesses for this information through different merchants.
Yeah, and probably last part is about like we were discussing how to steal like up to $100 from 1,000 people. But what is the reason to do this if you basically can steal 100 millions at a time? Yeah. Recently, in the last 3, 4, maybe years, hackers started to realize that, in fact, it's not so hard to get inside of banking network, for example, by exploiting web vulnerabilities or other network components vulnerabilities. Or, of course, the easiest way is to use phishing emails and malware. And once you get access to even operators' network with operators' workstation with the lowest privileges, it's just a really matter of time to get access to ATM management system or point of sale management system, or in our case, interbanking exchange network, well known as SWIFT. So in the last 2 years, there were a lot of attacks on SWIFT network, and SWIFT basically says, guys, our network is very well secured. We have 3 layers of VPN protection, and surprisingly, and our software is also contains no vulnerabilities. The problem is that you guys do not use, for example, air gap. Yeah, your SWIFT terminal should be air gapped from whole your banking network, which makes complete sense. But in fact, no bank will actually do this in real life because it will cost them so many effort. So typically, how this attack will be looking like. Here's an example of our security investigation like 2 years ago in one bank which were attacked by major hackers group which were aimed on the ATMs, but actually there is no difference. So everything started with malware via phishing email. Then 1.5 months later, with problems of network segmentation, spawning on other servers, getting access to domain administrator system in Windows network, they finally get access to workstations which was owned by engineers which had remote management systems of ATM network. And surprisingly, 2 months later, then they got access to money in those ATMs. Instead of ATMs, they could, the same way, get access to SWIFT terminal. And how it will be working in this case? Well, remember the story that 99% of hackers are lazy, yeah? But the 1% is really guys who got access to software via their internal channels, while the guys who were fired from banks or some other channels get access to software. In this case, some hackers got access to SWIFT terminal. They reversed it. They found how to substitute code which will be responsible for comparison of signatures, which means which information which were signed and compared in front of operators' eyes would be completely different from the one which would be sent to SWIFT network. And in fact, even to the printer would be sent completely different information for visual confirmation. And they created this malware, replaced this library in SWIFT terminal, and surprisingly, as you may be well aware of, they stolen around $18 million in Bangladesh haste.
Thank you. That's all right. So we've discussed quite a lot of different areas, and this is something we're really passionate about, but we weren't able to put everything in the presentation that we would like to. In conclusion, many of these issues arise really from the adoption of new technologies and lots of different technologies in the payment ecosystem. This causes big problems because actually many financial institutions, their understanding of payments is quite theoretical, or it's based off standards for different protocols. The problem with this is it's nothing like real life, as we've shown you. So the only real solution is that many financial institutions need to carry out regular real-life testing that's as close to an attacker's perspective as possible. But not many of them do. So thank you very much for listening. I've got one other request. Now, I know we're not in Europe, but I got nominated for 3 different categories in something called the European Blogger Awards, and I would really appreciate it if anyone would be happy to vote for me. It's a very short form, and it will only take a minute. And if you have any questions, please let us know. Any questions? Okay, yep.
So there's a credit card chip attack you didn't mention. Is that because it's high level or because why you didn't want to put sugar on the chip, spread it across, put it in the machine 8 times and it accepts it?
It's mainly because we're trying to focus on giving several examples in different areas, and we're trying to cover quite a breadth in payment technology. So it wasn't that we were trying to miss anything out, it's just to give people a bit of an idea of what's going on. Thank you. I think we had a question.
Based off just what Tim did, your encounters with banks, it's safe to say that a lot of the stuff, the vulnerabilities and all the other aspects, really just based off of pure arrogance on their part, it's safe to say that they just, I've said several times, this is, there's no vulnerabilities, there's no way to get it, we've all heard that before. But is it safe to say that a lot of these issues are rising over the years, just pure arrogance? What would you say?
Well, it's really the question at what point bank will start to lose money, yeah? As soon as they will not losing money or use their insurance for somehow will mitigate these losses, they will keep telling you that they are completely secure and everything is good. But it's really like that happens all over the world. Yeah, there is no difference. Obviously, fraudsters will be choosing every bank, yeah, and every bank will probably contain the same problems. This is only the question: what bank will come to us next, yeah, or what bank hackers will come next and start to exploit their vulnerabilities there.
Any other questions? Yep.
So, like TLDR was this talk that sometimes, especially for lower ones, banks do not give a shit.
Yeah.
Are there any recommendations for us consumers how to better protect yourself? I mean, like, should we have like a couple of cards and like don't use my main salary card for paying like online or something like that?
That's a really good question. So actually, in many cases, the question was, what do we do as consumers to protect ourselves? And the answer to that is, first of all, a lot of this risk is actually covered by either a merchant or a bank, but you should do things like enable limits on your cards if you have the ability to do that. You should enable notifications for online banking, for example. You should do general sense things around the use of your mobile phone, for example. And I think we just have to consider that some of this is a potential that could happen. So I don't know if you have any, do you want to add?
Yeah, in most paranoid case, you can use cash and gold, you know, and stones, things like that. But really, if in a better scenario, you really should be aware of what your risks are potential. Yeah, because I know so many cases when banks are trying to sell, 80 years old ladies contactless cards. They will not use it ever. Yeah, but they will be in charge of potential risks if someone will touch them in the metro, yeah, and that's the case. If you don't need like 10 cards, online banking systems and things like that, you can really narrow your attack surface.
Follow-up question, like, since you're from Europe and I'm as well, Like, do you know any legislations where you get, or complaints proceed? So for example, a real life scenario, I recently went to a bank in UK to open an account, and and I saw a lady has a workstation. She says like, your security is very important for us, and she enters my personal details in a Windows XP workstation. And then she locks it and goes away, and she leaves me in the room with a low lock, but Windows XP workstation. Like, I don't believe their security. Like, is there any way I can say like, okay, Windows XP is not supported anymore, they should not be using it as a workstation?
I think in those cases you probably have to direct your complaints directly to the bank, but at a more a higher level, if you are affected by fraud, there are national agencies that you should, and it's very important to report this information to. So for example, in the UK we have an organisation called Fraud Action, which is directly tied to the police and to our government agencies, and there are similar organisations in the US, and it's really important for a couple of reasons. The first is otherwise a lot of this goes unreported. There's no way that they can actually deal with it unless you notify them. So I would say if you are actually affected by something, don't just stop at your bank, but go to a higher level. Sure. So that's a really challenging thing, because you could take your money elsewhere. I don't really know what the answer is for that, because I think it would be quite hard to, for example, affect that. All you could do is notify. I'm sure they have a complaints procedure, but it depends really on what their policies are. Any more questions? I think we had one. Yeah.
I was just curious, many credit card companies classify merchants and FCC codes and merchant classification. Do you have any statistics on the bad rate across all FCCs, or is there a subset of FCCs that are at higher risk than others?
Yeah, so the other category, there is an other category, in which case that means that you have a lot more options, for example, when you're making different transactions on a terminal. So I don't have any official statistics around that, but there certainly are different categories which allow you to carry out more dangerous kinds of transactions. So another thing is you could set yourself up as a casino and issue like a quasi-credit, which isn't good either, and you shouldn't be able to, say, if you're a retail merchant. Any other questions?
Yeah, I just want to add, it's really, the problem is that, for example, for all those attacks which Leon was showing you about cards fraud, all of them might be really investigated and proved from a customer's perspective that, for example, I did not disclose my PIN anywhere, yeah? There were really situation when fraudster somehow bypassed your restrictions from terminal side and made my transaction without PIN verification, yeah, or with other reasons or with other circumstances. So it's just a question that, of course, you as a small human being don't want to fight windmills, yeah, and try to resist with huge organizations like bank or other financial institutions. But you have to, guys.
Thank you very much.